Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Jeffrey Hanna, Director of North America for SBD Automotive, and welcome to our industry thought leadership event, Mobility at a Crossroads. Given all the recent uncertainty around all types of mobility services and business models, compounded by the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, we thought it particularly timely to really take a pause to reflect on where mobility services are at today, and most important, provide all of you with needed perspective on where we're headed in the future. To represent that disruption, what it means to all of you, we have partnered with 8 world-class mobility providers to really help us with today's session and bring you those critical insights. These providers every day are transporting riders, participating with governments, renting vehicles, making sure services are clean, working with dealers, enabling car sharing, and all the things that it takes to provide a mobility service. So let's go ahead and get started with a few rules of the road today, and then we'll get into our content. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. We're absolutely glad you're here and investing your time with SBD Automotive and our partners to make this a great event. I'll be emceeing and making sure we stay on time today. And we've had over 700 registrations who are sharing in this experience. Our goal is to stay positive and really collaborate over the next 2 hours. We, of course, are going to raise those tough questions, but also provide you with the actual insights on what's happening next. And it's important we have a critical dialogue around the 4 mobility domains we're really covering today. By all means, let's make this a two-way conversation. We want all of you sitting there to engage with all of us and our expert speakers. Please interact through today's session in 2 important ways. One, we're going to be doing a series of poll questions to get the expert view of where you think the market is going. And secondly, we're going to have some important Q&A at the end of each panel. We're going to do that through the chat window. So really to optimize that experience and we don't get so much background noise, we've muted all attendee microphones for now. But if you need something, please let us know and do that through the chat window, and we're here to help. So as a way of introduction, our host company today is SBD Automotive. SBD is a global automotive technology research firm. We cover connected car, autonomous car, and secure car technologies. We do that through publishing a number of industry-leading reports a year, providing expert consultancy, and offering a variety of data solutions for all our valued clients and partners. So again, happy to host today. In the mobility space in particular, SBD publishes a quarterly mobility guide covering all services in the market, pricing and packaging services offered, and we do that throughout the globe, US, Europe, and China, and work with our clients on mobility strategies, the back office, and most importantly, enabling a winning mobility experience. Over the past 2 years, we've tested dozens of mobility services throughout the globe and definitely would like to work with all of you today to make that and your experience an even better one. So to learn more, you can contact us at sbdautomotive.com. So our agenda today, we're going to keep this fast moving. Mo Albador is going to kick us off with a State of the Union, so encompassing all of our SBD Automotive research in covering the overall mobility market, what consumers are saying, where the industry is at, and really critical recommendations for all of you. Then we're going to have 4 lightning sessions. We're covering fleet management, autonomous mobility, dealer mobility, and gig economy. For each of these 20-minute sessions are going to follow the same format. You're going to hear from 2 excellent companies. They're going to tell you what they do in the market. We're going to have a great discussion with each of them. And then, as I mentioned, open that up for questions. So let's go ahead and get started. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mo Albador, who will provide today's keynote session. Mo has successfully led SPD's mobility division since 2016, and in that time has offered numerous reports on the topic and has worked closely with SPD clients on numerous projects focused on strategy, business models, and of course, user experience of mobility services. Please virtually welcome Mo. Take it away, Mo.
Thank you, Jeff. So I'm going to start by quickly defining what we mean by shared mobility and then looking at a general evolution of how we believe that will happen. As you know, there's a lot of definitions out there, so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So really, because there is no one definition of shared mobility, there's a few emerging forms for the space. So the first one is micromobility, and we've all heard about kind of those low-cost scooters, bicycles, EV bicycles, and other small vehicles that are kind of low-cost, free-floating, dockless models. And they've been in the news a lot in the past couple of years for good reasons and bad. Then we have kind of the more traditional car-sharing model for basically short-term car rental. And that's, again, we've seen a lot of market entrances and exits in that space as well. Then you have ride-hailing, which is kind of a form of taxi hailing. That's kind of the Uber and Lyft model that everyone is very familiar with. Carpooling is more allowing users to join already existing pre-planned journeys. And probably the most well-known of that is either Waze Carpool or some of the sub-services for Uber and Lyft as well that allow for carpooling. And then we also have the P2P sharing, which is kind of the Airbnb model for car sharing. And kind of in addition to that, we have the fleet aspect of things. So looking at those business-to-business services that include vehicle tracking, diagnostics, workflow optimization, maintenance, and other items as well. And then the multimodal aspect of shared mobility, which is really an aggregation of all of the above and all of the services that that we have mentioned and talked about as well. So in terms of who the key participants are and how they're still exploring what they want and what they want to be in the market, what they don't want to be in the market, really we see the different roles as selling cars, manufacturing cars, developing software platforms, managing ecosystems, and selling services. And there are some that are looking at kind of an end-to-end mobility role where they cover all of the above. So if you look at the OEMs that are getting into the B2C aspect of shared mobility, they're looking to incorporate all of these roles under their umbrella. And then you have the mobility enabling car brands, which really do everything short of operating the consumer-facing aspect of the business. And then there's the premium-only car brands, which are going all the way to developing the software platforms, but they're not really very interested in managing the ecosystems or selling the services directly to the customer. And then you have the mainstream-only car brands, which we see as mostly interested in selling and manufacturing cars. And really that puts them in a position where they're more of a supplier to the shared mobility sector than anything else. That's kind of where the tier one car makers come in, where their role is to manufacture vehicles and work directly with the service operators in order to provide these vehicles as that tier one. And then we have the disruptors in the market. Those are the Ubers and the Waymos and other services that are looking to develop the software platforms, manage the ecosystems, and sell the services as well. And then we have other companies that are more focused on a singular part of the ecosystem, and we'll be speaking to some of those in today's sessions as well. And then there's the services that are consumer facing, the customer facing, that depend on this value chain and depend on this ecosystem in order to provide the services to the end customer. And really, we're seeing a big shift in value kind of from the bottom of this chart towards the top of it as well. So in terms of where shared mobility is going, so we're looking at kind of in the next 5 years, the fleet and mobility model will continue to evolve. It will become more seamlessly integrated within local environments. So really in the past couple of years, we're seeing a shift from that single model era where you have a car sharing app, a ride hailing app, a carpooling app, into more of a multimodal view of things. So we're already seeing a number of providers that have expanded to include these new models, whether it's by offering new services or by acquisitions and partnerships. But we're already seeing that a lot more. And in the next couple of years, we expect to see kind of more consolidation towards multimodality. And then eventually we'll get to a point in the next 3 to 5 years where we're looking at that all modal era, where basically you have a mobility manager app that helps the user manage their entire journey, whether it's using mobility providers, their own vehicles, public transport, or anything else. And then beyond that, we're looking more at the smart modal era, where we see more integration with smart cities and more integration with kind of a single service, single app for these services as well. So taking a quick look at the consumer perspective next. So we did a consumer survey and published this late last year. So ride hailing is still not as prevalent as one would expect. We expect people, everyone to have used Uber or Lyft or equivalent services around the world, but really we're looking at smaller percentages than expected. However, of those that have used the services before, they are quite popular, and the vast majority of consumers said that they would use these services again. So there's an obvious appeal for their customer base in order to use them. Looking at car sharing in comparison, you can see the top parts of the chart quickly shrinking, and really the overall visibility of car sharing remains low in comparison. There's still a significant amount of loyalty from people who have used it, and there's you can see that China really as a market is more evolved from a car sharing perspective at least. And then looking kind of at the P2P model, so we're seeing consumers are reluctant to share vehicles and are really unclear on pricing expectations for sharing their vehicles. So in a recent survey that we did this year, we saw that European consumers would demand about 60 euros per day to share their vehicle with other people, whereas they would only be willing to pay about 45 euros per day. So there's a clear discrepancy there among the same user set in terms of how much they value vehicles versus how much they value their own vehicle. And then overall interest in sharing their own car versus interest in using a shared car as well, you can see is kind of not as high as one would expect. So taking a deeper look at the automotive industry in particular to see what is going on there. So this next slide that will pop up in a second is just looking at kind of which OEMs are looking at a sophisticated brand, which ones have a scalable model, which ones are profit focused. And you can see that just by taking a quick look at this slide, there's a difference in the strategies that different OEMs are taking, and there's a difference in kind of their performance within those different strategies as well. And really what we see from the automotive OEM perspective is that they have generally struggled to scale. So there's this could be due to lacking in experience in consumer-facing services. This also could be the motivation for launching the services is just kind of that fear of missing out, wanting to have the brand presence in the mobility space, but really having no incentive to scale those services while they wait and see where the market goes. And then the last reason we see for that struggle is the large overhead costs of owning and operating vehicle fleets that I'm sure a lot of attendees today can relate to. And then kind of staying with the OEMs, we can see that automotive OEMs have a stake in over 40% of the mobility services that we study, and that stake could range from an investment to providing vehicles to full ownership. But if we look at car sharing in particular as kind of a standout, most of the services are hyper-localized services. They have few vehicles and little profitability, and that's regardless of that percentage of utilization, which really brings us back to that scalability being so important for the success of these services. And then looking at the costs in particular, we know that there's numerous expenses to making a profitable business case, but we've done a quick study, or we've done previous studies on what the operational costs look like in terms of, and this is specifically for a car sharing service. And we can see about 2/3 of the cost goes towards vehicle depreciation, insurance, and staff and personnel, whereas only a third of the cost in comparison goes to everything else, which includes maintenance, includes the fuel and charging costs, includes parking, credit card fees, background checks, everything really that includes operating a shared car service. And really, one of the other aspects that we feel is still elusive is that perfect mobility user experience. Given our studies in the past, we've done a lot of work towards assessing the user experience from services that are already in the market, and we've lined out what we think is kind of the main elements towards having that good user experience. So there's the preparation stage where you support the customer in discovering the service, learning about the service, and reserving their first vehicle. Then you have the actual driving, so teaching the customer how to start their session and operate the vehicle, how to fuel and recharge their vehicles, and then how to park their vehicles as well. And then the next step is that support stage where you assist the user in learning about the service and then supporting them through accidents or any troubleshooting that they might require. The transaction stage, it's basically the different payment methods. It's how to be transparent in that payment and how to finally engage the customer in terms of promotion, social media, and ensuring overall loyalty by continuing a constant but not overwhelming level of communication with the customers. Next up, I'll be just kind of taking a quick look at the market here. So first of all, looking at ride hailing. So Uber and Lyft have definitely opened up the mainstream mobility market, but they've incurred massive losses. And just to kind of put this more graphically, you can see the change in the business traveler ground transportation market in the past 4 years. You can see in 2014, ride hailing accounted for less than 10% of that market, but that has grown to eclipse both taxi companies and car companies, with taxis taking a particular hit, and the likes of Uber and Lyft reaching about over 70% of the market share for business traveler ground transportation. In parallel, just the increase in losses that Uber and Lyft have incurred in between 2018 and 2020, this has gone up almost fivefold when combining the two together. And then looking at the car sharing market, so we're continuing to see cancellations and withdrawals, but it's really not all bad news. So if we only focus on the negatives, where we have Share Now and Reach Now as part of the Daimler BMW alliance pulling out of their North American markets. Maven has recently announced that it is pulling out of basically winding down the brand overall. And then Blue Indy announced that it was pulling out of Indianapolis, but keeping services in Los Angeles. But on the other hand, we are seeing a bit of a gap develop, especially in cities where services like Reach Now operated. They had a high level of utilization. People actually used those services and relied on them to get from point A to point B. And we're seeing some services, for example, AAA's gig car share service, sweeping in and filling that market gap in these cities. Looking further north, we're seeing the services in Vancouver and Canada overall continue to expand and continue to grow their fleets, whether they're local ones or expanding in new markets as well. So there's bad news and good news there as such. Fleet telematics we see as a very crowded field, but historically speaking, there's solid profit to be made across the multiple links in that value chain. So we have a very good panel today that will speak to this. But definitely fleet telematics is a big part of shared mobility, and it's a very important part of shared mobility that is a kind of a mature market as well. Looking at autonomous shuttles, really the value chain here is still in its infancy. So it's being developed in very much an ad hoc way. So there is no right answer yet toward when it comes to autonomous shuttles. And then the providers are typically designing the architecture, whether it's electrical and mechanical themselves, and they also tend to provide the associated fleet management and maintenance services as well. So there's really a lot of opportunities here. And then if we look at kind of the on-road autonomous shuttles participants are really going after various market segments, and that includes that delivery as a service as well. So we have kind of a range of brands that are focused primarily on moving people so far. And then on the other end, we have some services that are focused on moving goods only, but there's a lot of services that are also intent on kind of the combination of that, moving both people and goods. And of course, we can't go through this presentation without mentioning the effects from COVID-19. So the app downloads for Uber and Lyft are down by 80% year on year in the US market and about 60% globally. The number of rides has gone down by about half. And then the trips to transit stations in particular have gone down more than half as well, with more than 60% in New York alone. And really, shared mobility companies have largely suspended carpooling services to promote social distancing and making sure that there's not too many people in vehicles at any one time. And we're seeing some initiatives where car sharing services are adding cleaning supplies and sanitation wipes inside the vehicles in order to appease to customers. And we're going to see kind of long-term germophobia impact on the sharing model. Now, there's an argument whether that impact will be positive or negative, where more people would be willing to sacrifice more in order to buy vehicles, or we'll see a shift from a lot of public transit users who would be willing to pay a bit more to use car sharing and ride-hailing services and interact with a few less people in terms of just sheer numbers. And really, with that, I'll hand it over back to Jeff Hanna, who will introduce us to the next section.
Thanks so much, Mo, for that excellent summary of where we're at today in the market. For this next topic, we're going to cover fleet management. As Mo said, fleet has been largely a bright spot, knowable profits. It's gone from really a nice to have to need to have. Over 80% of fleet operators have a connected fleet management system. And really our panel is going to talk about fleet overall, but also kind of what is the role of last mile delivery and that growth. So before I introduce today's moderator, let's just move to our poll question. We want to get everyone involved here with your thoughts on fleet. Excellent. So what I'll do is I'll read out the question. We're going to give you about 20 seconds to answer. So over 90% of connected fleet management service revenues are generated by the aftermarket rather than built in by OEMs. So does our audience expect this to change significantly over the next 5 years? Or I don't expect this to change significantly within 5 years. Again, back to our audience, we'd love your opinion. Give me about 10-second warning to get your votes in. 3, 2, 1. Let's see those results. Wow, a little bit of a split here. So we've got some who believe they expect it to change significantly, some that don't expect that to change significantly. So that's a good preface for this next topic. It's now my pleasure to kick off the fleet management panel by introducing Mr. Lee Coleman. Lee is the head of Connected Car globally at SPD Automotive, who will introduce today's experts. Lee, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. Delighted to say that we got two leading experts who are solving fleet challenges in quite different ways in the value chain. First up, we have Emilio Di Paola, who's been with HERE for the last 9 years. Started his career as Director of Sales Support, then becoming Senior Director of Product Management. But most recently, he's been VP of Product Management, which includes becoming HERE's go-to guy for fleet management services. Before that, he brings over a decade of international experience from TomTom and TeleAtlas with a focus on building location-based services. Second up, we have Dean Phillips, who's the worldwide technical leader for Automotive at Amazon Web Services. So as a technical executive and strategist, Dean leads a community of automotive solution architects who apply AI, machine learning, and IoT technologies to build connected mobility, autonomous vehicle, and smart factory solutions for their customers. So welcome, panelists. Hopefully, Dean will be able to join us. If you can't, can you hear us, Dean?
I'm here, Lee, but for some reason this camera just won't cooperate, of course. So I apologize for that.
As long as you can hear us, we can hear you.
I can hear you. Yes.
Great. So we've seen interest in FMS and penetration of FMS, fleet management services, grow exponentially in recent years. Emilio, if I can start with you, what do you observe to be the driving forces behind that growth?
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me here. The question is about what are the disruptive cases in the fleet space that we observe, correct, Lynn?
Yeah. What's been disrupting and growing the application of FMS?
Yeah, well, there are definitely, and even nowadays more with the COVID, as was said into the introduction, there is a trending force, which is the need of fast time delivery and prime delivery that has been set by the giants of delivery like Amazon and others for the last mile. So that was something that was not really seen as relevant like it was 2 years ago, right? When we spoke about fleet management in the past, we were always thinking about taking in mind the brain goes to a truck that needs to move freight from A to B, and normally is across a highway. So that's what we call the middle mile. But definitely the last mile delivery, which comes with a huge level of complexity, it's definitely a must to solve a problem nowadays, and where the connectivity is a need, because to optimize the fleet, you need to be connected to know where they are and how the traffic congestion, et cetera, et cetera. We can speak about it later.
Okay, thanks. Well, Dean, I'd like to pull you in at that point. Emilio spoke about last mile delivery there. What kind of tech are you seeing coming to market that's helping with that particular sector?
Yeah, Lee, there's an enormous amount of new technology that we're seeing put into fleets, in the form of aftermarket devices that include cameras. And so the rise of edge computing, with the combination of traditional data from the CAN, the car area network, and cameras are creating some really cool new use cases that fleets are able to take care of that help in a number of different use cases, like insurance purposes, understanding rolling stops or different traffic situations, warning drivers of events in the vehicle, and then being able to stream that data off the vehicles to be used, to provide proof of delivery, transparency for customers, safety situations, of course, driver awareness and attentiveness. So, fleet managers that are able to take advantage of this technology and continue to push the limits at the edge, I think are going to provide a better experience for their customers.
Yeah, quite right. You said a few things there that made me think that we've moved from a world that promises next day delivery to one of hyper-localized deliveries, where I expect a parcel or even a burger to be at my doorstep in 20 minutes, let alone sort of 20 hours. Arminio, you've got some services in your portfolio that cater to that. But how do you apply tech to that particular situation of those sort of hyper fast demand and supply?
Well, we are over time transformed our company to become from a map maker to just like from the 2D to the 3D digital maps and what we call the representation of the world in this reality index. And then once you have the good representation of what's happening in the environment around you, how the landscape of the environment looks like, what the traffic is all around, what the kind of disruption you can have from incident or hazard warnings. And that's what all here technology core focus is. Then the consumption of this information is critical for the service provider to optimize, for example, if we speak about next hour delivery, to make sure that my fleet goes, I have a time window to deliver. I know that the city is only allowed that delivery for within that time window. How can I optimize the tour planning of my fleet? So I have 10 trucks to ship into the city of Chicago. Downtown, I can only deliver in 2 hours, which is the optimal route that those 10 vehicles need to do to guarantee my prime delivery to my prime subscribers. This is where the technology that us, AWS, and all the ecosystem technology providers within the space need to give to the service provider, because that's what the fleet operator is looking for, because the customer is paying for such a prime delivery. That's a challenge for us, but this is definitely an opportunity where the technology is available to serve those needs.
Yeah. So so we've talked about the speed, the need to have very live conditions when you're planning that kind of service. If we look at the fleet management sort of industry, it's not hard to count 200 or more companies operating in the space, calling themselves sort of SaaS providers. It's a very crowded market. What do you think it takes to build some market share beyond scale and brand recognition? Those that are seeking to enter market or build their presence. Dean, what are your thoughts on how to differentiate?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier about taking advantage of edge technologies, combining camera with traditional vehicle data, location data, fleet providers are really going to be able to differentiate there. But when you combine the edge capabilities with what OEMs are starting to build into vehicles natively, we can see kind of a set of offerings, using APIs from the OEMs to kind of take the burden off of the fleet providers to make that connection into the vehicle to get vehicle data. So I see kind of a path where OEMs are building a set of easily consumable APIs that enable fleet providers to focus on those use cases that I talked about earlier, and less on the plumbing, getting access to the vehicle data directly themselves in their own devices. So I think we'll continue to see these next-gen connectivities solutions come from OEMs that will enable the market to kind of change from this, simplify the connectivity for the fleet providers.
Yeah.
And then, I always like to say that, every vehicle needs an API, every person, every city needs an API. And so when you can instrument new mobility experiences in that manner, it opens up the market to more entrants. So it's an exciting space right now.
I'm really interested in what you said just then. I'm going to park the OEM side for just a second, because I was really interested in every person needs an API. I hold that belief as well. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think, to be able to participate in transactions and experiences with vehicles and cities, for example, all three of these things need to be connected. And so I'm really excited about a lot of the technology and some of the research I see people doing, even with blockchain and micro transactions, micro payments from vehicles passing through intersections at different times, within the city, surge pricing, even the concept of parking for fleets where they're able to park in a red zone to unload a package, and they can pay for that transaction, or that permission to offload there with a transaction enabled through something like blockchain. So, reducing the cost of tickets that fleets will pay. So there are lots of capabilities there from people, devices, and the cities themselves.
Thanks. I could talk all day about that, but let's pull it back to OEMs for a second. We've got many on the line. The survey that we did just a few minutes ago showed that 63% of those on the line do agree that OEMs will have a more full role in fleet management services. Dean, you spoke about APIs that are being developed that are coming off the back of our march towards 100% embedded connectivity. Emilio, what are your views on OEM involvement in fleet management services?
Well, they definitely have a critical element of the chain. Without their contribution, I mean, they're let's say opening and giving access to the API, then there is no connectivity, there is no optimization of the fleet. So I'm honestly surprised to see and pleased to see the results of the pool. Also because we observe a trend that where there is more and more the tendency of making the head unit more, as much as possible, headless, like, and moving the edge computing under your mobile phone, primarily for professional drivers, or into more this type of mirroring your device with the head units of the vehicle. I'm not an expert at all, so I'm just like reporting what we are observing, but definitely there is a need for opening, giving access to the sensor data into the vehicles and speaking with a system that can reduce the consumption, can optimize the vehicle. I need to be able to track the vehicle. I need to be able to speak with the vehicle to tell him that he needs to turn on the other way around because there is an accident. Otherwise, that prime delivery. But it's not only for the city delivery for the last mile. This is obviously equally valid for the middle and the first mile piece of the overall chain. And I mean, without the critical role and without the contribution of the OEM, all these connectivity paradigm, there's, like Dean said, giving an access to APIs would not happen. And we all are strong believers that this must happen because this is a way that technology can help. Those weeks, we are really much involved in trying to understand how can we guarantee in the next weeks, in the next months, contactless type of delivery of goods and packages, right? Because of people, the social distances, it's very much relevant. And automation, and it's very, very important. If I don't want you to ring my door, I want to tell you where to drop off my parcel. Or I want to tell you, if you are around my yard where I have all manufacturing, I don't want you necessarily to wait for a long time and all this paperwork. It's a mature market, fleet management, but it's highly under-digitized market. There is
yes,
immense.
It's so
immense. Exactly.
Yeah, I was agreeing with your point there. It's quite fragmented. The ROI has been proven, the benefit to the consumer has been proven, but it's still we can't quite get the digitization, the digital connections right.
The amount of paperwork and the amount of transactions happening indeed with exchange of papers, it's unbelievable. So this gives us the hope that there is room for opportunities for the technology providers. And that's where we strongly believe that this is the next trend is to digitize the small fleets, even though they remain super fragmented, but to digitize them, it's a large area of opportunity for technology providers.
Quite right. So we're almost out of time. So I'd summarize to say we've got a handful of OEMs who are staking a claim in the fleet management space. They're only measured on one hand at the moment, really. And the two paths appear to be, shall I integrate my data to someone else's ecosystem, or shall I try and build the full stack to the full revenue potential by itself? I think the overall direction is clear that our fleets are getting more connected for the benefit of consumers and those operating them. We've just got time for a couple of questions that have come in. First one I'd like to put, this is to you, Dean. This is on the chat. To have an integrated transactional realm, you need to have a seamless, powerful connectivity. Is that a hinder right now?
So the availability of connectivity, yeah, I think we're clearly at the point where almost every vehicle coming off an assembly line is equipped with embedded connectivity. So I think we've solved the connectivity issue, or largely, and now it's back to the point I was making earlier about instrumenting the vehicles and the services available there with APIs so that they can participate in these transactions. I talked about cities and infrastructure with APIs to enable that. And then lastly, of course, for people to do the same. So it's really about completing that instrumentation, making the vehicles and the technology we're deploying in them updatable. I need to be able to send commands to these devices to be able to do deep logging so I can understand what's happening. And I think, just to end on it, I think there were 12 or 14 software-related recalls in the first quarter of this year already, at least, and the number is escalating quickly. And those are going to be resolved in the future with the over-the-air updates and this ability to do deep logging. So I think we'll continue to see that evolve, and it just opens up the possibility for more dynamic interaction, for fleets and for passengers and the constituents within these cities. So it's a really exciting space.
It sure is. Well, you've given us some really inspiring thoughts there, guys. Thanks so much. It's such a shame that we've run out of time. I could have carried on so much further with you both. But thanks again for your contribution. Great stuff.
Thank you. Apologize for the lack of a camera.
Not at all.
Thank you for inviting us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Jeff, ready for our next session?
Terrifically. Thank you so much. Next up, we're going to cover autonomous mobility. So as we talked about earlier with COVID-19 has really highlighted the potential and importance of autonomous mobility in delivering goods and people through almost a humanless experience. However, autonomous mobility has sort of the dual challenge. One, to safely maneuver a vehicle that isn't being driven by a human, and secondly, nailing the business model challenges that go along with any mobility services. Before we get started, I want to turn back to all of you in our audience to share their view on some recent consumer habits. So during the past month, what percent of your families or your total purchases were delivered to your home? 0 to 24%, 25 to 49, 50 to 74, or above 75 to 100%. So I'm going to give our audience about 20 seconds to take that on, and then we'll show you those results. I'm going to give everyone a 5-second warning. Let's bring up the results on the screen. Wow, almost an equal split. So you can see here, while many have embraced full delivery of purchases over 75%, some are on the left-hand side of that curve and in between. So I don't think we have a clear view of that one yet, other than it's a diverse set of answers. So with that said, it's now my pleasure to introduce our next panel. As I mentioned, we're going to cover autonomous mobility. Next up, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Howard Abbey. Howard is an autonomous car specialist for SBD Automotive, who will guide our next panel. Before we jump in, Howard, just one thing from our audience. We did get a number of questions through the chat. Would we get the slides from the keynote? Absolutely. So with that, Howard, I'll turn it over to you, and you can introduce our guests.
Thank you, Jeff. Next up, I'm excited to introduce two incredible speakers in this area, Jack Wiest and Ed Olson. Jack Wiest is a senior principal engineer at Intel and vice president of autonomous vehicle standards at Mobileye. In his over 20 years at Intel, Jack has made significant technical contributions to a range of industry-first products and standards for markets that were embracing high-performance computing for the first time. With an end-to-end systems perspective, Jack combines a blend of embedded product experience with elegant software and systems design that will accelerate the adoption of autonomous driving. Jack is an adjunct professor at Portland State University. He holds 23 patents with dozens pending, and also chairs the IEEE P2846 Standards Committee, which is working on a formal model for safety in AV decision-making. We also are glad to have with us Dr. Edwin Olson. He is co-founder and CEO of May Mobility Incorporated, which is a startup focused on self-driving shuttles for city transit. May Mobility has launched services in 4 cities with its leading technology and city partnerships to improve transportation access for everyone. Ed earned a PhD from MIT in 2008 in computer science and electrical engineering, and is on leave from the University of Michigan, where he is an associate professor of computer science. Ed has worked on autonomous vehicles for over a decade, and he has also worked on the 2007 DARPA Urban Challenge. He has developed vehicles for Ford and Toyota Research Institute and has won numerous awards for his work. So now I'd like to continue by having each speaker quickly summarize their companies who are active in this area, what their role in the mobility value chain is. Ed, could you please share first?
Happy to, and thanks, Howard. So it starts with mission for us. May Mobility's vision is to transform cities using autonomous technology with the hope of creating a safer, greener, and more accessible world. When we look at cities today, we see tons of congestion. Average speed of a taxi in Manhattan, at least pre-COVID, was 4.7 miles per hour. And there are huge inequities in transportation that are really a source of drag on the economies of cities. And everyday people can't get where they want to go. And when I look at cities, I see parking lots and huge amounts of acreage devoted to transportation networks that could be better allocated to housing or retail or green space or schools. So at May, our goal is to build transportation systems that are going to help solve these problems by deploying autonomous shuttles that get people where they need to go safely, easily, and with a lot more fun. We think autonomy is really the key enabler that allows us to develop new kinds of technology, new kinds of transportation services at cost points that can have a really transformative effect. And we're really focused on getting out there and doing. So getting the unit economics right, making sure that we know what the costs of our vehicles are, knowing what the payment models should be, and matching the use case to the technology, making sure that we're going after problems that make sense today, creating a great experience for our riders. And kind of uniquely for May, we're really focused on partnerships with cities, partnerships with OEMs, partnerships with businesses that will help us have the greatest possible impact in cities. So our hope is that by putting these vehicles out in the world, we'll be able to transform those cities and make them greener and more accessible and a more vibrant place to live. And to do that, we've been out in the world, as Howard mentioned, in 4 cities. We've delivered over 260,000 revenue generating rides on public roads and mixed traffic with our shuttles, and we're looking forward to a lot more.
Thanks, Ed. Jack, I know Mobileye and Intel are huge in this field as well. Can you describe what's up with your company?
Sure, we'd be happy to, and thanks again for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Dr. Olson as well. So most of you know Intel as a chip supplier, but since our acquisition of Mobileye, we're really taking on the mobility as a service market in a big way. Many of you have Mobileye technology in your car today, with over 50 million driver assistance chips shipped, over 300 different car models, 27 different OEMs. Cars around the world are saving lives today with Mobileye-based driver assistance technology. And so we're using that very mature foundation of vision-based sensing to develop a fully autonomous driverless capability as well. Recently, Mobileye acquired MoveIt, which we can talk about during the Q&A, and the combination of MoveIt and Mobileye allows us to deliver a solution that covers every layer of the mobility as a service stack, whether we are a traditional supplier, whether we're providing vehicles that plug into another operator's network, whether we're operating a service directly and delivering it to consumers ourselves. So any of the variety of approaches to market we can now cover, and we're all in on this mobility as a service opportunity around the world, and look forward to taking all of you on a ride someday.
Excellent, definitely. Thank you both. To start a discussion, I have a question about utilization rates. We know that a key aspect for profitability for AV services is those utilization rates. Both of your company have a key advantages in that you have access to real world data. So Jack, in what ways is access to this data beneficial for analysis?
Well, it's essential, and that's one of the benefits of the MoveIt acquisition, because we have intelligence now about, as the earlier speaker mentioned, multimodal transportation. So it's not just about the car, it's the car that's bringing you to the train station or the bus terminal, and then you still need to get to where you need to go. And so the best way to achieve high rates of utilization, where you've got one, perhaps even more than one person in a car at a time, is to understand where is their demand. Where do the vehicles need to be, and when do they need to be there to achieve maximum utilization? And that's that's not something you can just guess. You need real intelligence and insights to be able to do that. And so not only through our large deployed fleet of driver assistance-based systems, which are kind of crowdsourcing the creation of a map and other features in the environment, but also through the intelligence of the MoveIt platform, which is used by hundreds of millions of people around the world and has tight connections with public transport operators. We will have that intelligence to know where cars need to be when, so we can maximize utilization and thus profitability.
Excellent. Ed, I know that you mentioned the 4 cities. What type of data and what type of benefit from that data are you seeing?
Yeah, and asset utilization is a huge factor. We're really focused on trying to make sure that we're building a business that makes economic sense. And if our assets are sitting idle, we're out of luck. I couldn't agree more with Jack about the importance of multimodal links and working with partners who know something about where the buses are going and where the trains are going. And one of the things that we're able to do is to find partners that can help direct where we launch to places where we can have a really great impact, but also a really high utilization factor, which makes the business come together. And then the flip side of that partnership is that we can provide information back to our customers, the businesses and governments that are principally underwriting our services, about how people are actually using the service and how a shuttle service like what we're providing can change their behaviors. And that's something that's really exciting to transportation planners because they're all worried about congestion and scalability in the future. So one of the things that we're very proud of is we've actually measured changes in behavior for our riders. Fewer are buying cars, more are going out to lunch, visiting restaurants pre-COVID. And so that's a really exciting thing for our customers.
Yeah, you mentioned COVID and how the industry and the world is changing as a result of that. Really, safety of mobility has taken on a new term because of COVID. Now we can think of hygiene and medical transport and less crowding. So Ed, have you seen a lot of changes in your mobility services due to COVID? And what are some of the ways you are looking to adapt?
Yeah, COVID's a huge challenge. We're looking at huge changes in the kinds of transportation demands that our customers have. More people are working from home, so fewer people need to ride shuttles. We're also looking at fundamental changes to how our assets can be used. If we have a vehicle that can nominally seat 10 people, but you can only put 2 people into it because of 6-foot social distancing, you've really impacted the kinds of service you can provide, and your operational costs are probably unchanged. So one of the things that we're doing a lot of is talking to our customers who are very rapidly evolving their thinking about where are we now and what is the transportation world going to look like on the other side of COVID. And we're looking at all kinds of things that we can do to help serve the immediate need, because we really care about real transportation services, but also make sure that we are in the right spot, ready to deliver transportation services at a high volume when the demand returns.
And that demand is supposedly possibly switching to more individual car vehicles for the near term. Jack, do you see this as an opportunity for Mobileye to show more of its abilities to people, or is it really a short-term interaction for as far as Mobileye's plans are?
I mean, we think this pandemic could have long-lasting impacts. It'll change consumer behavior. It'll change, as the poll asked earlier about what percentage of goods are being purchased online. These kinds of trends aren't going away anytime soon. And so, if anything, COVID has really underscored the value and opportunity of automated driving and the ability to safely get somewhere without having to interact with another person outside of your household. We may be living with this for quite some time, but the world will go on, right? And the ability to deliver goods and or people safely and securely, where safe means not only without crashing, but also meaning safe from contagions, I think is a renewed opportunity for the industry. And I think, I think we all wish we had that technology today. And it would improve our lives under the current situation for sure if it was widely deployed.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, the long-term benefits of AVs. You mentioned the ability to be hygienic and safe by the contactless delivery. Are there other aspects that we are going to recognize more and more as this technology gets more deployed?
Yeah, I mean, certainly safety is the obvious one, and a lot of people have talked about it. It's, the statistics on how many people are seriously injured or worse globally due to human-driven vehicles is just staggering. There's really no other product on Earth, that has that kind of impact to people's lives. Not mention that, but just the economic impact to lost work, lost productivity, the time we waste sitting in cars, behind the wheel in rush hour traffic. And then, of course, you've got people with disabilities who aren't able to be as productive members of society as they could be because they don't have the ability to have, safe and affordable modes of transportation. You have the elderly, right, who also could live at home for much longer periods of time and much as they would desire if they have the ability, again, for it to be able to still get to the grocery store, go to doctor's appointments and things like that without relying on someone else. So the societal transformation aspects are profound, and we're excited to be delivering this technology to help change the world.
I think
go ahead, Ed.
Equity and access are huge factors for us. We have one customer who, before we started service in one of our cities, was paying $15,000 a year in ride-hailing fees to get to work after he got off the train station. We have another rider who told us that he spends 2 hours commuting every day, or he did before we came along. And the cost to those people, both in terms of real dollars and in terms of what they could be doing with 2 more hours of their life, is massive. And you multiply that across some of the real socioeconomic challenges that we have in the country, and the disparities that transportation and poor transportation systems have are enormous and hugely consequential. So we're out there, we're trying to provide this equity and access to transportation for everyone that we can.
Excellent. One of the aspects of providing for everyone we can, right now the technology is very limited in small areas. Some people have expressed interest in the chat box about how quickly will we see this technology spreading, Ed, in your case, to more cities globally, and Jack, for the ADAS systems, right now those are only in the main markets. When will they go down to South America or Africa? So I guess, Jack, could you address that first?
Yeah, sure. And there's 2 important aspects to scalability. One is just as costs come down, certainly for certain solutions, and as regulations require basic levels of capability like automatic emergency braking, I think I think we'll see that soon. The market rate growth for ADAS is quite significant, and so I think the next 3, 4, 5 years we're going to see probably near global adoption of driver assistance technologies. For driverless solutions, it's a really interesting question because your ability to scale is often limited by your map. We think about high definition maps are an essential capability for driverless vehicles to be able to operate. And the traditional approach of creating maps through really expensive mapping vehicles that drive around and around and around a localized area, and okay, great, I can deploy in this city. Now I want to deploy in another city, and you got to repeat that. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's costly. So we have a unique approach to solving that. The tens of millions of driver assistance vehicles that humans are driving around today on a daily basis are going to crowdsource a high definition map for our driverless vehicles. And so that way, essentially anywhere a human has driven with one of our driver assistance technologies, we'll have a map that the automated vehicle can drive into. And so while we are still planning our initial deployments to be 2022, starting in Israel and then moving to Paris and South Korea after that, because we're building a global map in parallel, once we've proven out the technology, we'll be able to scale very quickly because of that asset.
I think Jack touched on a couple really key ideas. I think of our business at living at the intersection of like a Venn diagram with 4 circles. Some of those Jack already talked about. The regulatory environment is hugely important. There's what the technology can do, but I'd also tease that apart as another constraint of what can you afford to launch into a market. So some technology may exist, but it may be cost prohibitive today to turn into an actual product. And then there's where's their economic demand. So if you look at kind of the intersection of the regulatory environment, what the technology can do, what you can afford to build, and what people are willing to pay for, you end up with the current accessible market. And we believe that is not the null set. We're out there now serving that market with vehicles in market generating revenue, which is really exciting. But the other really exciting thing, to come back to Howard's question, is that all of those circles are getting bigger. Technology is getting better, the costs are coming down, the regulatory environment is maturing, and so there's going to be a lot more over time. So there's some now and more very soon.
Excellent. One of the cost inputs is the data sets. Jack, you mentioned maps. Simulation data is another. A few companies have released small annotated test data sets to the public. NHTSA recently announced the AV Test Initiative to map the activities of what's going on. So Ed, what drives companies to share information publicly about their AV activity, but also from their AV activity?
I think every company in the AV space is trying to build confidence with riders, buyers, and regulators that they're approaching safety in a responsible and comprehensive way. And we're coming, thankfully, out of really a kind of a Wild West atmosphere where it's like, if you can build the demo, that's great. There were some pretty tragic deaths, and we're really trying to figure out how do you convince everyone that you're doing the right thing. And we brought in a lot of traditional OEM, so failure modes, effects analysis, fault tree analysis. But releasing data and talking about data sets is one of the ways that some companies have done that.
And I'd add to that by saying that I think transparency here is really key, and that's why we, our Mobileye division in 2017 published for the world to see a proposed safety model that would help the industry, government, and the public understand, what does safety mean for a driverless vehicle? How do we define that? And how do we want to decide what the appropriate balance is between safety and usefulness of these vehicles at the same time? And so that's why we're honored to be chairing the IEEE 2846 work group, which has broad industry consensus. We have Waymo as our vice chair, Uber as secretary. We have OEMs, tier ones, and technology providers from all over the world that are participating, so that we as an industry can have a consensus view on what does safety mean, and a common approach to thinking about safety and the kinds of assumptions that you just have to make in order to navigate kind of a human transportation world. So we think that's really critical to gaining public trust and to be a good partner, with government and the public alike around the world by being more open with what we're doing, how it works, and asking, is this right? Is this what you want? Let's make this a dialogue, not industry pretending that we've got the answers, but we can't tell you because it's a secret black box.
And being open and clear about complying to standards relates to another question from the audience, this one more directed towards Ed. How do autonomous vehicles rise to meet the accessibility standards that people with disabilities found in public transportations have? Obviously, wheelchairs is part of that, but also hearing limited and sight limited people need some assistance.
Yeah, and our accessibility is a hugely important thing for us. I think we were the first autonomous vehicle company to launch a wheelchair accessible vehicle in commercial service. And we continue to increase the accessibility of our vehicle by working with the advocacy groups who know what their needs are better than we do. And we can put a ramp on a vehicle, but that does not make an accessible vehicle. And so really talking with all the stakeholders there and constantly moving so that we can serve a larger and larger set of people is something that we work on actively every day.
Excellent. I wish we could cover more topics and talk longer, but we do need to leave time for the other sessions. I want to thank each of you now again, and I'll hand it back to Jeff Hanna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody, for sticking with us. We're going to move now into session 3, dealer mobility. And for this next topic, we're going to rapidly debate the changing dealership experience and what is the impact of mobility services, and really making that a touchless one at the dealer. So as dealers start to reopen across the United States and really across the world, they start with a number of advantages, including access to real estate, parking, vehicle inventory, professional staff. But before we get into the panel, I'd like to go to our audience here to get their sense of what they think about dealership mobility. So I'll read it out loud if you can't see the screen. Over the next 2 to 3 years, will the majority of U.S. car dealerships offer direct-to-consumer mobility services? Highly likely, likely, possibly, unlikely, or highly unlikely. So the idea that dealerships offer direct-to-consumer mobility. Leave the poll open for about 20 seconds. Give you about a 5-second warning to get your answers in. 3, 2, 1, hit click. Let's see the answers. Wow, so again, pretty mixed. A lot of people are in the middle, possibly, likely, unlikely, but not thoroughly convinced yet. So maybe we could use this panel to maybe change a few minds here. So let's go back to the slide, and I'm going to play double duty here. So I'm not only going to introduce the idea, but also moderate this next panel. So I'm pleased to have two expert panelists with me today, Lee Malloy and Mark Thomas. Lee Malloy leads R&D for Cox Automotive Mobility, with an emphasis on emerging technologies and mobility services, such as electric vehicle batteries, powertrains, and charging, as well as spearheading their sensor and calibration ADAS initiatives for their various fleet and retail clients. Previously, she oversaw reconditioning for Mannheim and joined Cox Automotive in 2010 in a strategy and corporate development role at Autotrader.com. She's held various positions in product and portfolio management at Autotrader before moving to the Cox Automotive side in 2015. Turning over to Mark Thomas, he is the VP of Marketing and Alliances at RideCell, and he's responsible for marketing RideCell, the world's leading platform to launch, operate, and scale new car and ride-sharing mobility services. Prior to joining RideCell, Mark headed up connected car marketing for Cisco Jasper, where he developed product and go-to-market strategies for automotive OEMs. Prior to Cisco, Mark led product marketing at Here Technologies and had business development roles including Apple and Nokia. So welcome, Lee. Welcome, Mark, to our panel today. So I'm going to give each of you a chance to really introduce yourselves now. I'm sure a lot of our audience have heard about RideCell and Cox Automotive, but maybe put a pin on it and tell us what you're up to in the mobility space. So maybe Mark, then Lee.
Sounds great, Jeff. Thanks very much. Yeah, so I think RideCell has been known for being a shared mobility platform, car sharing, both station-based and free-floating styles, as well as ride-hailing. And really the key value proposition of high-yield shared mobility has been being able to get those vehicles used as much as possible, stacking different business models. What we found this year is that our shared mobility platform is actually becoming even more now a mobility platform, offering people the ability to get into vehicles and not necessarily sharing them. So we can talk more about short-term vehicle plans and those roles within a dealership.
Excellent, Mark. Lee?
Great, happy to be here, and thanks for the intro, Jeff. And just as Jeff said, I've been with Cox Automotive 10 years and been part of our mobility division since its founding nearly 2 years ago. And the premise in mobility is that the transportation future looks very different than it is today, right? And specifically in terms of the technologies that are deployed on these vehicles to help people get around, as well as goods. So my focus is squarely on setting up to support our clients, which at Cox Automotive means OEMs, dealers, fleets, rental companies, and more, and how they grow into this new transportation by navigating things like the electric powertrain and early AV features like ADAS, and keeping their cars safe, uptime high, and on the road.
Terrific. Well, maybe we can sort of address the elephant in the room for really everybody these days, COVID-19. And I'd like to, you guys both spend a lot of time with dealers. Dealers are opening up, trying to get their businesses back on their feet. So how are dealers really changing and adapting to serve customers in a less physical way, whether it's demonstration, mobility services, sanitization, and everything in between? So Lee, why don't you start, and then Mark, I want to hear more on the mobility front.
Sounds great. And at Cox Automotive, one of the things we do is we spend a lot of time studying the consumer behavior, and especially that consumer behavior in the car buying experience, right? And, you know, we found and have studied the fact that dealers are really being asked by the consumer to refocus their operations to be both physical and virtual in the wake of COVID, right? That their businesses can't operate just on a physical platform alone. And these new sets of restrictions that COVID's implying on the consumer have changed how the consumer thinks about things like personalization, convenience, flexibility, and probably most importantly, that sanitation issue, right? So the good news is the dealers are responding. The dealer experience coming out of the stay-at-home orders has evolved. Many are embracing this new physical and digital reality, and 86% of dealers, in fact, are going beyond just conducting business in a physical location. And 58% of dealers have noted an increase in customer demand for things that make sense to us, but at-home delivery of purchased vehicles, but also service pickup and delivery. So when Jeff mentioned earlier, this touchless experience that the consumer wants, it is showing up at the dealership, and the holy grail for the consumer at the dealership is that online transaction, right? That digital transaction for retailing that the consumer expects to have, just like they can buy a home, an expensive piece of equipment for your kitchen, like a refrigerator, but you can't buy the car yet, right? So all of those pieces are coming together, and I see COVID is really accelerating that progress onto that digital online transition.
Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it really comes into kind of two distinct categories. There's the expectation for a different buying process, and there's also a new category of buyers. So from the buying process perspective, you've got dealerships that were considered non-essential businesses. Parts and service were allowed to be open, but the showrooms weren't. So we've gone through a period where car sales has been very difficult. The expectation now, since we're getting used to doing everything in a no contact style, doing it all digitally, in the past, the car purchase process has been a little broken when it comes to then doing all your research online. Then you show up at the dealership and you essentially have to walk in the front door, find a salesperson, and start explaining what you're interested in. It's very much not the epitome of a digital experience. So taking the technology behind sharing and using that for a no contact test drive experience is one of the great examples of how it's not about convincing a dealership to invest millions in a new business. It's about convincing a dealership that they need to invest thousands to create a better opportunity and essentially a new mindset. I think a lot of the folks want their customers to talk to a salesperson because that's how you upsell them. But now just getting them in is key. And so being able to let somebody download an app that's a dealer app, reserve their time slot, maybe they could take it for 20 minutes free or 2 hours if they wanted to do a longer test drive and pay some money for that, but then have that money applied to their purchase price. Then once you get into this, download an app and get in the car, you don't even have to have the cars at the dealership. You can start to put them in lots where the people are instead of making them come to where your cars are. So it's just suddenly a breakthrough in thinking. And so that's, adding in no contact, understanding the buying process has to change. And then the second piece is that understanding that there are going to be new customers now. There's folks who used to be public transit users, and there's a lot of studies that show that 20% of the people that took public transit almost exclusively won't take it anymore. And then another 25% are going to reduce that. And so we're seeing that folks that want to be safe and don't want to be in a shared space, but want to have a private space, are interested in getting in vehicles again. And so rather than go to a dealer and then what are your options? You can buy a car or you can lease a car for 3 to 5 or 7 years even. This doesn't really correlate with the amount of time people actually want to use that car, which might be until the vaccine is created, and that's what, 6-9 months. So being able to provide the convenience of a car share where you download the app, get in the car, and then you just keep it for a month or 3 months. So that's understanding and really taking these principles and saying, hey, this isn't just about sharing anymore. It's about providing the freedom and flexibility and simplicity to meet the needs of a new kind of consumer for new demand.
That's excellent, Mark. And both of your companies offer platforms in some ways to enable car sharing services, as you said. I know you're both on the road a lot talking to dealers. Mark, maybe start with you, and then Lee. What do you think the advantages and challenges are with dealers becoming mobility providers in some ways?
The dealership is probably in the best position to become eventually a mobility provider. So the chart that we saw earlier, where it's like, yeah, maybe half the people think they're not going to do it in the next 3 years. They have access to vehicles, they have staff, they have real estate to store them, they have service departments and service bays that can keep them clean. And really, when you think about, they have local market knowledge. They're not going to enter a market with a corporate mandate to put more smart cars in Arizona, in a place that prefers trucks and SUVs. So having all of these ingredients means that they're really in probably the best position to create this. And I think it's going to be the larger dealer groups who take the initiative. And fortunately, they also are used to acquiring their platforms as opposed to building it. When you get up into the OEMs, we're seeing that some of those companies are great. This is a great idea, but it's too important for us to outsource. We're going to have our own team do it. And it's just, we have 120 engineers building this, and that kind of expertise is really hard to replicate on your own. So the dealers fortunately understand, hey, it's about getting the best platform out there and getting into business and making sure that my expenses match the revenues that come in.
Lee, how about you? How do you think of the dealer as provider?
I echo a lot of what Mark said. I mean, the dealer in the future needs to be seen as this integrated transportation provider, right? So they need to show up to the community and the consumer with this spectrum of opportunity beyond lease and finance, right? That makes sense for their experience to satisfy any consumer's mobility. And the walk that a lot of these existing platforms have today, whether it's Cox Automotive or any other, for a dealer into mobility, is the transition of things they've already got and needs their consumers or customers have of them. So they've got a loaner fleet in many cases, and they've got customers that are interacting with their fixed ops department to pick up their vehicle and drop it off for service. That same platform, just as Mark said, can be flipped, right, to do this service pickup and delivery. Or you can interact with that same platform to do to schedule a test drive, just as Mark said. So it's these slow steps and slow walks that I think will enable the dealer to start to open up and monetize the different ways a consumer wants to get around. And it doesn't just have to be about lease and finance.
I'm going to go off script for a second. We've got a question in our chat from our audience. We'll start with Lee on this one. Why is the data showing that as showrooms are opening, customers are returning to the showroom? It seems there's very little online retail that's actually happening. So what are you seeing at Cox Automotive? Are people physically going back? And how much of this is really digital at this point?
I'd say it will continue to be a large part, right? We expect that while the silver lining in COVID, right, is that the traditional buying experience has been disrupted, and dealers are quickly embracing what we're calling these new buying alternatives. And a lot of that is what's called digital retailing and the enablement of purchasing the vehicle online, all are in part. And even as showrooms open up, I expect that trend to persist. Some dealers will probably be better adopters and maintainers of those technologies over time. Because at the end of the day, the car buying process is somewhat relational. There's still a segment of the consumer that wants to go around and kick the tires and test drive, but there are also growing segments, right, that do their research online and are comfortable with that completely digital transaction. So depending on that dealer's segment of the market they're attracting, their geography, I think they'll adapt their approach to meet their market.
Mark, I've got one for you. A lot of dealers have tried vehicles as subscriptions, right? So it sounds good coming out of the oven. You get the vehicle, the maintenance, the insurance, all in one, and then all of a sudden it ends up $800, $900 a month, even more than the price of a lease or even buying the car. So take us through that concept of vehicle as a subscription, and is your company thinking through a better way to do that?
Absolutely, Jeff. A lot of the early subscription plans were essentially almost vanity programs where you could switch the car. This week you can have your Escalade, and then 2 weeks later you can get your supercharged coupe. And yeah, they were expensive, $1,000, $1,500. So they were designed not, kind of in the opposite principle of sort of low risk-free shared mobility. I think now what we're coming to see is that people are looking for the simplicity of these car sharing services. And many of the car sharing services are now offering plans by the week to help meet the needs of those customers who say, I need a car. I actually don't want to have to share it with anybody else right now. I mean, I'll get in and wipe it down with my Clorox wipes. And so if we can get and enable a dealer to provide that same level of simplicity at a premium that's maybe 10 to 15% over a traditional lease, where they can, at the end of the month or pretty much any time they want, drive the car back to the lot and say, hey, I'm done with it now. That's, I think, the new sweet spot in the marketplace. And that's where we're engaged with a number of dealers to say, hey, it's, maybe make it a month minimum. You don't need all the same technology in the car that a car sharing vehicle would have. In fact, customers don't want to have to lock and unlock the car every day with their phone. There's some convenience with having a key, but certainly using, something like a geotab enabled dongle that allows them to know the mileage, to help them provide low-cost insurance, as well as bundle in the maintenance and proactively maintain those vehicles so they don't break down in the field, is a great way to provide that same level of all-in service without making it something that becomes this ultra premium offering.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the last word. I know you're playing in this space. How do you think about the subscription model long term?
An absolutely essential part of the transportation and mobility equation, right? I mean, we all know the consumer is in the driver's seat when it comes to how they want to get around and satisfy their mobility, and economics is also a big player in this, right? So the lease finance option for satisfying mobility isn't really working so well for many consumers who don't want to tie up their money on a vehicle asset that sits idle 95% of the time, right? So they're getting creative. They've been trained by other access monthly subscription programs like Netflix and Spotify. So that's the experience they're demanding. And certainly, just as Mark said, that the industry for subscriptions started out in this niche premium segment where you had flexibility in body styles and you could flip from your sports car to your SUV. You see just more mainstream models coming to bear now, and especially as, say, the sedan or the compact car is getting introduced into those platforms, it's really enabling the price to come down and be more attainable. But there's a program for everyone. One program I love, is there's an all-electric subscription program out in LA. So I think it's really going to be fun to watch how different programs pop up and really support different consumer demands about mobility.
Excellent. Well, I think in the interest of time, I've got to let you guys go. Big shout out to Mark Thomas of RideCell, Lee Malloy of Cox Automotive. Excellent perspectives. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jeff.
So our fourth and final topic, we're going to move into the gig economy. Really fascinating one here. And more than ever before, companies are leveraging the gig economy, flexible workforces to provision mobility at a lower cost structure, and even allowing everyday consumers to become small business operators. So for our next panel, we're going to work on defining gig mobility and identifying those future keys to success. So let's come back to our audience for a quick poll, and then we're going to turn it over to our expert panel. So the question we have here on the screen, how will your use of shared mobility services change after the effects of the pandemic have subsided? So are you going to reduce stay pretty much the same or increase your usage of shared mobility? Let's go out to the audience. You have 20 seconds. Give you that 5-second countdown. Let's bring the results up on the screen. Wow, almost half of our audience is planning to reduce their use, with a lot saying pretty much the same, and then of course some increase. So very interesting there. So that just says we're gonna have to work a little bit harder on getting these mobility services back on track. And really, for our final panel of the day, I'm pleased to turn it back over to Mo Albador, Head of Shared Mobility for SBD Automotive, who brings with him two outstanding experts who are really in the trenches day to day in this market. Take it away, Mo.
Thank you, Jeff. So I'd like to introduce to this panel, first of all, Harry Campbell, who is the founder of the Rideshare Guy, a media outlet for Uber and Lyft drivers, as well as gig workers across the world. He's also the author of the Rideshare Guide. And over the years, Harry has established himself as one of the leading rideshare industry experts, with appearances in thousands of top media publications, including the New York Times, CNN, NPR, and others. His site is trafficked by hundreds of thousands of visitors every single month. And in addition to the media side of the business, Harry also, together with his team, are active industry consultants, advisors, and investors in the mobility space overall. So welcome, Harry.
Thanks,
in addition to that, we have Brian Allen from HireCar. So after 30 years of service as a general manager and group director of business development at Galpin Motors, Brian founded Respective.io, which is a strategic advisory and investment firm focused on emerging technologies and innovation in the retail automotive industry. In addition to that, Brian joined HireCar in December 2018. He is a senior vice president of strategic partnerships, responsible for assisting OEMs and retail dealers with strategies to profit from the car sharing, ride hailing, and transportation as a service opportunities. Brian serves on advisory boards for several retail and technology firms on top of that, and he is renowned for recognizing industry trends and developing innovative solutions that leverage technology to improve the employee and customer experience for the automotive industry overall. Welcome, Brian, as well. So maybe starting with Harry, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about what the Rideshare Guy is.
Sure. Thank you, Mo, and thanks to the SBD Automotive team for having us here. I think you did a great job of laying out both of our intros, both for Brian and myself. Hopefully we can live up to the hype on this panel. And, as you mentioned, I did found the Rideshare Guy about 5 or 6 years ago now, and sort of what started off as a blog for Uber and Lyft drivers. I was actually out there, my full-time job. I used to be an aerospace engineer. I started driving for Uber and Lyft and pretty quickly realized that, it's not rocket science being a driver, but it is a little tougher than it looks. And so really over the years, we've sort of taken that worker lens, that worker viewpoint, trying out all the various services, and really covering the industry from the perspective of the worker. So Uber and Lyft are really the focus of the media side of the business today, but we also cover a lot of the food delivery apps. I've myself have done bird charging, so scooter charging, so really anything and everything in the mobility and logistics space.
Great, thank you, Harry. Brian, if you can do the same as well.
So just shortly, I came up in the retail side. Galpin Motors, one of the largest privately owned automotive dealer groups in the United States, oversaw the luxury brands and the Japanese and Korean brands for over 30 years. And I saw mobility coming. And as I decided to retire from retail, I thought that would be a great way to basically test out a lot of things that I saw happening already as a general manager of several stores, where there were opportunities for dealers to leverage, similar to what Mark just said from RideCell, leverage the assets and infrastructure they already have to increase utilization and, frankly, sell more cars via initially renting them and then selling drivers cars for mobility as well as subscription services for leisure and both gig economy, rideshare, food, and package delivery.
Great, thank you. So yeah, let's dig right in. Really, I'm glad you guys are on the panel. You really bring a different perspective from the other sessions today, and looking at it kind of from the driver perspective of things. We know that there have been a lot of there's been a lot of interest from potential drivers in driving for gig services, but there's always been a struggle in making sure that the drivers have the right vehicles or have vehicles at all. Can you tell us a bit about some of the challenges that the drivers have faced or the services have faced in matching these drivers with potential vehicles as well? So maybe Harry, we can start with you on that one.
Sure, yeah, definitely, Mo. And I think that you definitely alluded to really the main barrier to entry for a lot of gig workers, especially when it comes to Uber and Lyft. And one of the nice things about driving for Uber and Lyft is that basically, you know, I sometimes joke that really anyone and everyone with a pulse, if they want, they can get signed up and get approved and drive for Uber and Lyft. They do some background checks, but they're, you know, as long as you don't have any serious offenses or DUIs or things like that, and if you have your own vehicle, you can bring that on the platform, or they partner with a number of partners like Hire a Car, and you know, Lyft has their own program with Express Drive. But really, what it is all to say is that there are a lot of options for drivers, and there isn't that big barrier to entry generally, but really the only barrier there is the vehicle. So I think you really have a lot of drivers that are typically either own their own vehicle already, or if they don't, they go through one of the sort of third-party services like a Hire a Car or the partners with Uber and Lyft. And so that's really kind of the distinction you see. There aren't a lot of drivers that are going out there and buying brand new cars to drive for Uber and Lyft, but you do see a lot, you know, and especially when it comes to the flexible vehicle rentals and leases. I've always been just surprised at just how many, you know, there's sort of, we work with a number of these companies in different capacities, and they all tell me that they don't have any issues with demand. There's plenty of people that want to sign up, because you can kind of imagine if you don't have a job and you don't have a car, Uber is basically a godsend for you. You can basically get a car from them, start earning money, and even if you don't really know what you're doing, you're going to make enough to pay off the car, which might be $200 to $300 a week, you know, as long as you put in the hours. So that's sort of what we've seen in the past when it comes to drivers and their vehicles at a high level.
But Brian, from your perspective, kind of bringing the car and the car owner into kind of that P2P model, how do you see kind of making it financially sensible for all parties involved? And that includes the driver, the shared mobility company, as well as the vehicle provider or owner.
Right. Well, the key you just said there is sustainable for all involved. And the narrative that Hire a Car shares is that really companies that tried to reinvent the infrastructure that dealers or large fleets already own, including rental agencies, they find it difficult because if you're a Maven or some of these others that have now ceased operations, they never leveraged the dealerships platforms. And again, referring to Mark from RideCell, Mark Thomas, the dealer's in the best position with the real estate and the infrastructure. Oddly, some OEMs really haven't leveraged that. And it's kind of crazy because dealers are very innovative. And I kind of get a little defensive when I hear dealers are dinosaurs. The first thing I say is, first of all, dinosaurs still exist. They're just called lizards and birds. But besides that is that the dealers cannot run a negative cash flow business. They don't have the private equity and venture capital money that allows companies to run for years at negative. So a dealer jumps in once it makes money, or at least is not a drain on revenue. So what we do is we go to the dealers and we identify the cars that would work for either rideshare, food, or package delivery, and we give them the tools to manage it. And of course, today, telematics and insurtech and fintech have made the ability for dealers to enter this business with very little resource and very little financial investment. Matter of fact, they can start with no investment because, like Hire a Car and other services, we just take a piece of the transaction. So they don't have an upfront start fee. They already have the cars. They already have the real estate. So the exciting thing is that the silver lining to the COVID cloud is that dealers now are really open to figuring out revenue streams. And we don't just take the position that, look, you're going to rent cars and make money off renting. We take the position that you rent for mobility or subscribe vehicles to pay for the inventorying costs of vehicles, and then you'll eventually sell a high percentage of these people cars. And now the dealer's in the best position for that whole ecosystem. And of course, they benefit with what's called units in operations. They get more cars on the road, more services. And we have dealers that are doing really well where they have extended hours. New York, some may know of Brian Benstock with Paragon Honda and Acura. He's making tremendous amounts of profits through 24-hour servicing the gig economy drivers. So as dealers see now the opportunity to make money and not have to wait years for return on investment, but actually can start from day one, it works for the whole ecosystem for mobility. And 70% of vehicles on the road will qualify for these gig economy rentals. Basically a 4-door sedan with 4 wheels, air conditioning. You know, it's really, and we even have 4-door pickup trucks and all, you know, vans, of course. But it's exciting, and I think everything about rideshare that has declined, the reasons why people used rideshare pre-COVID still exist. And as we come out of this dark space, I believe it's going to be difficult to get all the way back up to pre-COVID because of travel restrictions for many. But certainly for a majority of reasons, rideshare will come back to a sustainable level and maybe even more profitability for the TNC companies. But certainly everybody else can profit.
Yeah, and if Mo, if I could add on to, I think Brian made an interesting point about the dealers. You know, I'm no expert in dealers like Brian is, but I think definitely on the driver's side, and sort of what I often see from different, you know, areas in transportation mobility. You have dealers, you have OEMs, you have all these different players who really see shared mobility or rideshare specifically as this huge opportunity, but they're often a bit lost at how to get in, what their entry point might be. And so I think that, you know, what it really boils down to is kind of understanding the needs of these drivers at a very ground level and sort of, you know, what it actually takes to be a driver. You know, what services can you provide at an affordable cost that actually give you a high perceived value to each driver's, right? If you're going out there, if you're a dealer and you're going out there with the intention of selling drivers cars, that's going to be a really tough sell because your acquisition costs are going to be extremely high and very few drivers are going out, like I said, and buying a new car to drive for rideshare. So if you look at it from another's perspective, right, especially in the times of COVID, what are the services that drivers don't have access to right now? There's a lot of actually surprising things that dealers may actually already have right now, like even bathrooms, free Wi-Fi, coffee, things like that. These are all basically, you know, negligible expenses, I think, on a you know, at a dealer level. And these are services where you can actually start getting drivers. You know, drivers, I kind of joke with people, they're only making $15 to $20 an hour before expenses in a lot of cases, right? So if they can stop somewhere and get a free coffee, if they can, you know, if they're on a pay per gigabyte cell phone plan and they can come somewhere and watch YouTube videos while they're waiting for rides or when it's a downtime, that's somewhere they can start to associate that dealership brand with someone who's providing them value. And then when they need services, or maybe when they do need to buy a new car, right, when they sort of have those multiple touch points, you have a much better and sort of more attractive offering to them than just a Facebook ad that says, you know, go buy a car at this place that you've never heard of.
That's really interesting stuff. So kind of taking a pivot and looking at kind of food delivery more than ride sharing. So we have a note from the audience that says that you know, there's been a lot of news coverage about how ride-hailing drivers are shifting from delivering passengers to delivering food and groceries as such. So I guess, do you see that shift as being permanent, or is it just temporary during the COVID times? And if you want to throw in a comment about the Grubhub acquisition and whether you saw that coming or not, and how that could have an effect on the US market, that would be great as well.
Sure, I can start off and then turn it over to Brian. I think that definitely, you know, on the food delivery side, what we've seen with couriers, especially early on, was that, you know, obviously when everyone was sheltering in place, there was a huge spike in grocery delivery and food delivery. Where we saw it more, though, I think was in the grocery delivery sector, and Instacart has ended up releasing some numbers that they initially, I think, hired 150 or 200,000 drivers and then hired 200,000 or 300,000 more. And I can probably confirm that. This is sometimes where it helps to be in a position like mine, because we're actually referring drivers to Instacart. So I know last month, for example, we referred and actually activated over 1,500 new shoppers. So that's just my platform alone. So I can imagine that they, activated many, many more, 10 or 100 times fold more than that. And so we're definitely seeing a lot of demand. I think what's interesting, though, is that there's this larger shift in the economy with 30, 40 million potentially unemployed people. And you can kind of imagine if you're unemployed with, no opportunities to earn, the gig economy was basically built for that. And so that's sort of what we're starting to see now, that early on, there was a lot of opportunity in grocery delivery. There was some opportunity in food delivery, but I think since there's so many players, it was a little more disaggregated. But now things are sort of balancing back into equilibrium. If you've been ordering on Instacart over the past few months, you might have noticed that you can almost now in most cities actually get a delivery in 1 or 2 hours again. Early on, it was actually days sometimes before you could get a delivery. So I think we'll see that shift, but I do think that grocery delivery, for example, I think is a much more sustainable unit economic business than food delivery. So I'm not convinced that, as things come out of COVID, and as people start to go out and about, I think there will be some benefit, that some of those folks who use grocery delivery services will think to themselves, hey, this is very convenient. But I think on the food delivery side, it'll be much less. So where that becomes interesting is if you're a platform or a provider, and you're going out and partnering with food delivery or partnering with grocery delivery, or even looking at rideshare, you want to sometimes think about the unit economics of the business and even the sort of long-term viability. Because if you go out and make, a huge investment in that space, and it turns out, that the margins are just so low on food delivery, and about 50 to 70% of the orders are from fast food places like McDonald's and Chipotle, where the average order value is very low, and oftentimes the delivery fees plus tip plus service fees actually are more than the cost of the food. You might imagine when the subsidies stop, there aren't going to be too many people, still ordering, whereas Instacart has a $35 minimum order, so the average order value is much higher.
Right. And Brian, kind of from your perspective, obviously the requirements for a package or a food delivery vehicle are much lower than what's required to deliver a human being. Are you seeing an influx of kind of lower quality and maybe older cars onto the hire car platform for that purpose in particular?
Yes, and more specifically to the point, because rental agencies specifically have been tremendously impacted with lower utilization rates, they have lowered their daily rental prices significantly so that food and package delivery drivers can rent very economically. We have rates as low as $20 a day. And what the audience may find a little surprising is that the vast majority of these gig drivers are part-time. They're driving maybe 3 or 4 hours a day. So they still have their vehicle for a lot of personal use. And that's where, going back to the dealership opportunity, those people will typically want, the drivers will typically want to get a vehicle that they may eventually buy. And even dealers will rebate some of the rental fees towards a down payment on what we call our earn to own program. But food and package delivery, certainly agree with Harry that the grocery store is what's really, that lift is probably going to be more sustainable. And, I still think certain things people want to pick up at the store, bottled water and toiletries, I'll have that delivered, but I might go get my fresh seafood and meat. But I do believe that the overall ability for a gig driver, their options have increased. And probably one of the nice things that I've seen with food and package delivery drivers is an increase in female applicants. So people that may be hesitant to do rideshare for whether it's safety or COVID concerns, they're much more comfortable with food and package delivery and getting into that industry. And of course, you've seen where Uber and Lyft are now also doing delivery services for what's called Uber Direct, Uber for Business, Uber Connect. They're delivering parts for dealerships. So a dealership, where they're in reduced operations, they don't want to call back all their parts delivery people, but they can use Uber Connect to do parts deliveries spontaneously, and in some cases much more efficiently. So a lot of neat things are opening up through the storm that we're going through, the sunlight coming through the clouds.
That's interesting. You touched on the demographics in particular. I want to hone in on that point. Traditionally, with ride-hailing, with Uber and Lyft drivers, we've seen a lot of retirees kind of doing it on the side part-time just so that they can get some extra pocket money. Harry, are you seeing these people also switch to delivery services, or is that too much of a hassle, too much of a physical burden for them, and they're kind of sitting out this round?
Yeah, so what's interesting right now is that I think you have sort of coming out of COVID, you have different constituents in the gig economy with different concerns, because right now, frankly, rideshare is sort of heating up. People are starting to go out and about, and especially depending in certain states, but at the same time, you have a lot of drivers who are older, like you mentioned, and may have sort of concerns about the coronavirus or may have pre-existing conditions, and then at the same time, they're all getting unemployment. So the PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, pays $600 a week to all gig workers in addition to their state's weekly amount. So some drivers are receiving anywhere from $600 to $1,000 a week, regardless of how many hours they were putting in. And since a majority of drivers do work 10 to 20 hours a week or less, they're frankly, a lot of them are making a lot more on unemployment than they are actually driving. And so I think that a lot of the drivers who are citing safety concerns are able to say, I'm not driving right now because of coronavirus, but that's also because they're getting paid this unemployment every week. And so I think there's actually pretty good demand right now for these rideshare platforms. We have drivers that, the ones that basically are more, willing to take the risk are making money. We featured a driver last week. It's a bit of an outlier, but he was in Arizona and made $4,000 a week, which is basically unheard of. He put in 80 hours, but still at an hourly rate of $40 to $50 an hour. That's pretty insane for a place like Arizona. You usually don't see that. So we're seeing a lot of opportunity there, and sort of as far as the demographics, I think that going forward, you definitely have these different safety concerns, I guess you would say, and that's why I think food delivery is interesting. Grocery delivery, I would say that there's still you're still going into a store and not everyone is wearing face masks, so you have some considerations there. But I mean, in sort of the ideal food delivery situation, you're in your own car and you go in and you have a mask on, you pick up the food that's waiting on the counter, you leave it contactless on the customer's doorstep. So you actually really never come within maybe even 10 to 20 feet of another person, maybe 5 to 10 feet. So I think from a sort of coronavirus safety perspective, if you were most concerned with that, food delivery is probably your safest bet.
Interesting stuff. So thank you very much for your insights. We could go on forever on talking about this, of course, but in the interest of time, I just want to hand it back to Jeff Hanna to wrap it up. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Tremendous panel, Mo and panelists. So thanks so much, everybody. It felt like those 2 hours really have flown by. We covered a great keynote on the mobility landscape. We covered what's happening in the fleet management space, autonomous mobility, the opportunities around the dealership mobility model, and ended with a very thoughtful discussion on the gig economy. So a lot of you have asked these questions, so I'll just kind of go over them with you to wrap up. So first of all, thank you so much to all of our attendees and expert speakers for a great session today. The event recording will be made available immediately after today's show. So tomorrow you'll get a link thanking you for your time. We'll have a link to the recording. So if you want to go back and see something, check out a conversation, go back to a slide, all that's made available. At SPD Automotive, we take your opinions and experiences extremely seriously. As part of that, thank you. You'll get a quick 2-question survey on one, what do you think of today's event? And secondly, any areas that we can improve. And it still feels like we're in the early stages of how mobility will ultimately unfold. So please continue the conversation. You can learn more at www.sbdautomotive.com. And again, really want to wrap up and thank you everyone for their time today. Thank you.